Welcome to the Parkinson's podcast Unfiltered with hosts Heather Kennedy and Kat Hill, brought to you by the Davis-Phinney Foundation. In each episode, Heather and Kat dive deep into the raw emotions and realities of life with Parkinson's.
Hey, Heather.
Kat, we both look as if we're a little swollen in the eyes. We've had some sadness. There's been some loss.
Yeah, there's been some loss. And it just keeps coming, Heather. And I don't like to focus on that. I try to work really hard to stay in joy and gratitude but there's been some hard stuff.
Yeah.
Others in my world diagnosed with some really hard neurologic things and death. And I think it's hard to love so many people that have this disease.
And when we're diagnosed with an incurable condition that is progressive, especially, the idea of death becomes so immediate, a certain reality. Before it was over there, kind of like how I used to think of people who were about my age. Oh, they're so old and frail and inconsequential. Why do they even bother showing up? They're just so, out there. That's a long time away. And now it's here. And now, just like death feels. After watching my father die, as an example, it's just like it's right here next to me.
Yeah, and you and I both have that in common, Heather. Both our dads died of this disease or complications from this disease. However, Parkinson's was listed as my dad's cause of death. Yeah, he was in hospice care and they listed Parkinson's, which is interesting. I think for me too, I guess I don't fear death itself. I have always known life is finite, right? We've always known that. I think part of what I'm tired of grieving is the incremental losses, the incremental, slow deterioration of my neurologic function.
Mm-hmm.
I'm moving in more to the mid stages. I don't believe in looking at staging, and my doc doesn't bring it up. We both know the scores and all of that, but I choose not to think about that a lot.
We're not a number.
We're not a number. And if we choose to constantly look through the lens of that, we filter a lot of good stuff out if that's what we see first as the stage of Parkinson's we're in. The reality for me is I'm moving into lots more off time. I'm moving into more fatigue as my tremor, especially in my head and neck, are really affected by off time. I try to describe it as I feel like I'm shaking from the inside out and my vision shakes. And it's not the end of the world. It's just the next step in all of this and trying to manage it. And when others are dying from neurologic disease in my life, it brings it really to the forefront.
Yeah.
That real grief.
It's cumulative.
Yes.
It's what happens when we don't have time to process the next loss. The waves are too close together. We feel as if we're literally suffocating or drowning. And when I say we, I'm speaking of this as a universal experience with a little bit of a caveat here that, each person grieves in very different and individual ways. As they say in the Hospice Foundation, some have compared grief to snowflakes or fingerprints. Each person's grief is both personal and unique. And hospice is there for a lot of this period. So if anyone has a great idea about the process of dying, it would be them.
I was, both my parents in their death experiences were in hospice. Mm-hmm. And my aunt, who is currently dying, is in hospice. I believe they are the experts at the process and they are expert guides. And I think in this culture, we don't talk enough about death and dying because it is universal. It's something we should be talking about.
Well, there are a few things we can do. There's a
Yeah,
group
what are
called
those?
You're Going to Die that I've joined. It's actually a joyful poetry, live readings, art group where we are
Say it
free to
again,
express.
Heather.
It's called You're Going to Die.
You're going to
And
die.
anyone can look that up. And then there's also the Death Cafe, which is, non-denominational as well. What I like about the You're Going to Die is it's this diverse and dynamic population of people dedicated to moving through the grief. In fact, here is they say, bringing diverse communities creatively into the conversation of death and dying, inspiring life by unabashedly sourcing our shared mortality. Concerts, open mics, workshops, places to communicate for the hospice patients, prison communities, and anybody really.
Let's talk about that a little, Heather, because I really know in my brain, I know that I can't experience true joy without accepting loss and grieving loss. And I believe with every fiber of my being that it is a privilege for me to have the opportunity to love my extended family and my family and to walk in life with them. And I also feel responsibility to honor them as they die. And that is a gift. It is an honor. And it is also a touch point to, I know I can return in my brain to joy after a death. I know I can return to joy at a new stage of Parkinson's. I get lost, though, sometimes in the grief part, and it doesn't happen very often, but it really is a disorienting experience because we try so hard to stay in the now and to stay present. And it gets very difficult to step back and look at the big picture and weigh universal birth and universal mortality in the same context. It's part of what we will go through, and it's profound, and it's hard, and it's hard, and it's lonely.
And in our desperate attempts to make sense of it, this profound and gutting experience, we have all kinds of things. For example, in religious forms, they will often show a statue with one hand down toward earth and one toward heaven, which reminds me of the Wim Wenders film, Wings of Desire, where the angels, one of them played by Bruno Ganz, are looking down on earth and they can sort of lean their heads on people's shoulders and hear their innermost worries and try to soothe. It's the most they can do. They can't really interfere with the beings, but they're present. It's all the people who've passed on. But the angel wants to come back to earth because the angel fell in love with the trapeze artist, wants to relinquish his space in heaven. And just like the show 6 Feet Under, where we start watching and spoiler alert, each character die. When the first character dies, you're like, oh my God, they shot Keith.
That right.
You've come to know this character. You love him. And then one by one, each character dies. And you go, oh, wow. Of course. Of course.
And the whole show, the context of that whole show is around death. It's around a family that does, their profession is death and dying and burials. Yes. And it's a great example of the universality of it. I think back before diagnosis, okay? It's not that I didn't know or didn't think about death ever. It's that there wasn't a constant physical reminder of something that it may or may not kill me is the reality.
It's visceral.
It's visceral. And it's literally for me with my tremor, often a shaking hand in my face going, oh, remember, you've got Parkinson's. And so there's a different kind of baseline that I feel like I operate from since my diagnosis. Things feel more precious, which is a gift. The days that I'm on, the days that I'm not symptomatic, even, I mean, I can have a good day even with a lot of symptoms. I've said that before because I'm not going to look say bad or good based on symptoms. But I don't have the freedom anymore to not have the context of thinking about my disease. And the more I think about my disease, because I need to manage medicines. I want to stay ahead of the game and try to use the medicines as long as I can to manage the symptoms. But the reality is, this is going to get worse no matter how much energy I put into it or don't. And that's hard. It changes the context and how we live. And I think people don't talk enough about that part, the life-changing angst that gives us. And many of us with young onset, there's many younger than I that have been diagnosed. You were younger than I was when you were diagnosed.
That's true. And the loss is continual. The alchemy of all these changes, as C.S. Lewis said, the death of a beloved is an amputation. You know, we can't go back and forget it. Every death is somehow cumulative. When we go to grieve, what I noticed in the line, when people were telling me stories about my father, they were bringing their own stories of grief when they lost their special people. And so we come into the room with this accumulation. Also, it's so important to remember that none of this is in our control. Death and taxes, I guess they say. But if we pull the lens back a bit and think about something a little more universal for just a moment, the pale blue dot written by Carl Sagan about the picture taken of Earth from quite a distance was remarkable because it reminded us that, you know, here we are squabbling over all this stuff, a fraction of a dot of a fraction, you know, like over who's going to stand where on this blue marble. And it's inconsequential. We are just mayflies. We're just blips on the screen. What's so important to me right now, universally or bigger picture. And yet that doesn't make me feel any better. It just reminds me that I'm not in control, which is kind of a relief. I mean, I wouldn't want to live a long time, especially with this disease. I don't want to become a burden. And that's another fear that you addressed. You touched upon.
The surrender part. Yeah.
It's so hard. How do we surrender?
Right.
Do we go kicking and screaming? I mean, ideally, we'd like to put it in a nice little bow, like we're going to get everything in order. I don't know about you, but I've never seen a death that was in order. You go in and there's total chaos, physically and otherwise. I went through my cousin's bookshelf and I realized I didn't know her at all. And I felt shame. So much shame. Why didn't I ask her these questions? Why didn't I read these love notes? Why didn't I see this stuff?
I don't like to, but I often reflect about all these things that we do to prolong our lives now with medical science. And now I'm not talking Parkinson's, right? I'm talking in general, you know, a pill for everything, this and that, so that to minimize risk, right? So I've got some other comorbidities, so other disease processes going on. I may talk the most about Parkinson's, but I'm thinking, maybe one of those would be good to die from. I was thinking the other day, maybe I should stop treating some of those things when I get close. But even that isn't a predictive thing. But it makes me wonder a little bit about, are we prolonging quality of life? And that's, for me, what matters. And while I have quality of life, I believe that I will make as many choices as I can to stay healthy. And I'm not advocating anybody do anything drastic. I'm advocating that when we have thoughts about it, when it feels scary and hard, that we can acknowledge that. And I just hope that somebody out there listening feels a little normalized by this process. And if they're struggling, thinking about getting some support, there's so much work being done in this area about palliative care, depending on what part of the country you're in. And people think that palliative care is just for end of life, and it's not. It's for everyone who is getting to a time in their life where their disease or their circumstances are impacting their quality of life. And palliative care can help us manage what we want our quality of life to be.
Palliative care is a huge industry.
It's a huge and growing industry, right? And there are advocates advocating, for lack of a better word, for more of it, for better access to it. Because don't get me wrong, Heather, I know what a privilege, and I know you do too. We know that we have the privilege of having health insurance and money to pay for medicines and even access to healthcare providers. And I know many in the world don't. So I can, even in my sadness, I can find glimmers of gratitude.
And we've known many elders in the Parkinson's community who've died as well.
Yes.
And many of us lose our voices for a long time. And losing our voice is quite literally like unable to speak clearly or communicate in that way is probably the greatest of all the losses I've seen so far.
Very dehumanizing.
Yeah. I talk a lot with my ex-podcast partner, Mike, who says people always finish the sentences. And I go, no, that's just me. He's like, no, everybody does it. So, yeah.
That happened a lot with my dad. And the result of that is that people stop choosing to engage.
Yeah.
If they're not heard or listened to, or cognitively it's too hard to follow along. And that's not unique just to Parkinson's. Think about any cognitive impairment, dementia, stroke, hearing impaired. That's a big part of quality of life, especially for us, Heather, because we are talkers.
Yes. And you know what I like talking about? And I know this sounds macabre, but death, grief, loss, and dying. I have been mirroring, or rather shadowing, what is called a death doula. And you've worked as a professional with also people who are doulas for birth. And both things can be held at once, to create and to destroy, but the destruction is coming no matter what. And many of these death doulas, or people that work in this industry of sort of caring with and for the bereaved as well as the person who's dying, remind me that we don't all have the same experience. It is not the great equalizer. That is not true. I said that once, and I was quickly reminded that is something only someone who's privileged enough to have enough to take care of themselves would say. There's not a lot of dignity sometimes.
And a doula is merely a person that supports others. And so a birth doula or a postpartum doula or a death doula is somebody who trains specifically for those areas, has knowledge base about resources and ways to support people, and can walk with them on those journeys. As a midwife, I worked with many professional doulas as they helped support families through labor. And it's a valuable, valuable resource on both ends of these intense life experiences. Part of why I think it's important for me is that because it is a universal experience, I don't want it to feel like taboo for my kids. I don't want it to cause fights in families. I've been very, very blessed. My brothers and I haven't had any disputes or arguments around my parents' estates. And it helps that there's not a lot to them, but it can be that way if we talk about it and we know our wishes. And maybe it doesn't have to be so hard for everybody. And I think those of us with Parkinson's need to think about what we want and talk about it with our families and what are our resources. And it's hard. It's hard to think about. Yeah. It's hard to plan for. My mom wanted a party. She didn't want money spent on a...
Do not weep at my grave.
Yes. She was a poet, and she had a poem that she wanted to be read. She wanted her ashes spread in a certain way, and And we did that. And she wanted just a small group, but she did not want hours of testimony and is it testimony or what's the word when somebody comes up and gives a memorial talk, or she didn't want that. And so she wanted a celebration. I'll be gone. So I want
The dead
people to
don't
do-
care,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Would you write your own obituary? You ever
No,
tried
I
that? It's
don't.
quite a trip.
I don't want money spent putting it out there. I mean, people will know, they can send an informal email. Cat
there's a
was
pop.
well, then she was dead.
Yeah.
The
Her
end.
house was clean. I'm hoping it doesn't say that about us.
Yeah.
It won't say that, by the way, about mine, for sure. Not. I would say because we don't have a place to put it, it's kind of like when we lose a friend and the friend's still alive, very much. And for whatever reason, you're not friends anymore. There's a real grief that hits you that feels very similar to a death. And when we lose our capabilities, it feels very similar to a death. How do we reconcile that? How do we work with that? Like you've often talked about, making lemonade and all that. And I think that you've done great at adapting to all these losses
Thank
that
you.
we're now, feeling very sad about today. But so what would you recommend people do when they're really stuck in that cycle?
Use your lifeline. Use your touch points. Call a friend. I already feel better and cheered up just from talking to you, Heather. And I think we need to remember we're not alone. And it's okay to talk about the hard stuff.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes I'm guilty of not wanting to show the hard parts to people that I care about. I don't want to burden them, but I think it's healthy. I think it's healthy for my marriage to talk about them. Ken and I have had some really good conversations the last few days about death and dying and about the progression of this disease. And I know that it helps me to feel lighter in my grief. I also am aware that I'm lucky to have friends that I can reach out to. And there are organizations like the Davis Phinney Foundation,
Yes.
like some of the groups that you mentioned, hospice groups, palliative care. There are counselors. There are great grief resources, mental health resources if people are feeling stuck with grief and don't have anywhere to turn. And I often try to remember that those of us that are still alive can carry those that have died with us, that it becomes our privilege to bring them with us.
May I read a very short poem from a friend that lost her mother, her father, and her grandfather
Please
within a
do.
very short period of time? Her name is Kelly. She's an incredible poet and friend. In Lieu of Flowers by Kelly Travis. I am one of 4 adult children who are ever lost. 5 months after Dad dies, Mom dies too. This is our state, another world. A dream, a test, a permanent run-on sentence. I lose days underneath covers. I wear pajamas to walk the dog. A faux pas, I would never. The colors outside are muted, as if a summer storm was coming. Dull, hazy molecules scatter the violet. A Ziploc baggie of sleeping pills in my sock drawer is unoriginal. I just want to pause. I'm one of 4 adult children, the oldest, bereaved, tall, godless children. I might be here for months, years, forever without a dad and a mom. I'm one of 4 children. In lieu of flowers, we ask for cards and memories of dad and mom. And now grandma. But people feel better giving something that fills the hands. In lieu of flowers, please. We have enough to carry. Our hands are full.
Beautiful.
Hope I read that.
You did
Right.
well. Yeah.
That's another thing. People don't know what to say. We
Mm.
don't quite know how to say it. We feel awkward. We'll say, call me if you need anything. My mom said, just don't even ask. Just drop off food and ring the doorbell and run. Drop off something and run. Take blankets over there, Because she said, don't wait till they ask you, because they don't know what, sometimes people are too stunned.
Thank you for letting me talk with you, friend, and for maybe
Profound.
sharing this with the broader world a little bit. I think it's an important, unfiltered topic for us.
It's one time I wish that they could see us because your eyes go so deep.
They're a little
And,
red these days, but thank you, Heather.
I'm just honored to know you.
It's an honor to be on this journey with you. And thank you for being my friend.
Thank you for being my friend. I don't know how I got so fortunate in this life.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Parkinson's podcast Unfiltered with Heather Kennedy and Kat Hill. For more information about the Davis-Phinney Foundation and to learn about educational offerings and community events for people affected by Parkinson's, please visit davisfinneyfoundation.org or dpf.org. This podcast includes information about Parkinson's and insights from our Parkinson's community. It is not intended as a substitute for treatment advice from your own medical providers.